Merry meet Annie here, talking this time about Mabon ap Modron. Why do we name the autumnal equinox Mabon? Because as with so many of our celebrations, there's a god for that. Or maybe not. Probably not in this case, but we'll get to that in a bit. In this case, the god would appear to be Mabon ap Modron. Mabon, the son of Modron. It's more literally translated as the son of the mother. It's not actually a name, it's a description. Here's a short version of his mythology. He was a Welsh deity, perhaps, who may or may not have been based on an actual person. He was son to the goddess Modron, an earth goddess, and was named the Child of Light. His name first shows up in poetry in the 10th century in the Pagur, if I'm pronouncing it right, one of the earliest poems regarding the exploits of King Arthur. Modron, Mabon's mother, is a symbol of the great goddess, as she was often revered in Welsh, Celtic, and Gaulish mythology. She is that which endures, literally the earth. Long before face and figure were ever given to deity in those cultures, it was the land itself that was the deity. Modron was the human form given to the earth, as are so many of the ancient goddesses from these lands and times. Mabon's father was Urien, who was an underworld deity. As the son of those two, Mabon was the union of what is seen and what is unseen, and was named the Son of the Light. And it's thought perhaps he was pictured as young and bright and literally fiery. When Mabon was 3 days old, some mythology says 3 years old, he was captured and held prisoner for uncountable years in the mythology. In other world, it was called Modron's womb. That dark place was a place of challenge, but also a place of nurturing. He was held there so long that he was considered to be the oldest of all humans and all animals, kind of held into a time beyond time length. Well, and then he was rescued. Well, pick your story about what happens next. There are many, but the gist of most is that he was rescued because he was such a skilled hunter, and there were certain tasks that only he can do. You'll find this in Welsh mythology, and you'll find it in stories of Arthurian legend. Here's the interesting thing. It starts to get interesting now, my friends. Historically, not only is there no reference to a celebration to the honor of the god Mabon at or around the autumnal equinox, there's actually, historically, no proof of any celebration of him anywhere. Well, at least not prior to the 1970s. I'm going to use some words next from Sarita Dieste. It's in her blog on pathos.com, and you can read the whole thing there. It's called Did Mabon Steal the Autumnal Equinox? And I'm taking her words because she captures how I feel about this and how most educated people who are studying mythology and folklore around the gods that are part of our Wheel of the Year feel. She has a way of, in this case especially, disagreeing with the status quo when it comes to this supposed deity, but not in a way that's, belittling of the possible importance of the tales told about him. I like the respect that's in this, even as she kind of tells us it's false news that not only did he exist, but that he had anything whatsoever to do with the holiday we call Mabon or the autumnal equinox. These are her words. I found out that due to a series of mistaken assumptions sometime in the 1970s, the autumn equinox was named as Mabon by a U.S.-based author. And perhaps because Mabon sounded more authentically like an ancient festival to some than the autumn equinox, it soon became the preferred name for the festival. The author was Aidan Kelly. Back in September 2011, I wrote a blog about autumn equinox and the Mabon, and in a discussion about it, Aidan kindly took the time to come to explain what really happened. He admitted that when he was creating a calendar in 1973 or 1974 or 5, he named the autumn equinox Mabon. Comparing it to the name Litha he assigned to midsummer, that's where we get that name, he said fall equinox was harder, meaning harder to name. He goes on to say that he found the solution in a book about Stonehenge, in which the author discusses a smaller circle at Stonehenge aligned to the autumn equinox. Taking this as his inspiration, he made comparisons to the story of Demeter and Kore, and decided that Mabon had similarities to Kore, concluding that Mabon could have been the myth associated with the date. Where's the conclusion evidence for that, my friends? And he did say it was not certain, but also not invented arbitrarily. I don't know, it sounds pretty arbitrary to me. So, how the heck do we end up aligning Mabon to the autumnal equinox? Sarita refers to that as a merry equinox dance and offers the following, again, her words. And now, I will lead you on a merry equinox dance going full circle to an actual ancient festival which happened at the full moon just before the autumn equinox, and which can, through a series of ancient associations and jumps, perhaps be associated with Mabon, though through his possible association with Apollo. Based on what we know, the Romans believed that Meponus had enough in common with the god Apollo. Meponus, by the way, is tied to Mabon, as perhaps one influenced the other, Mabon perhaps being older. That an aside to you. So the Romans believed that Meponus had enough in common with the god Apollo, a Greek god, that they adopted their own pantheon of deities, and they equated the two. That's Apollo with Meponus with, therefore, older than that, Mabon. From this, we can perhaps learn a bit more about Mabon if he is indeed the same as Meponus. And in my reading, friends, this is me speaking, and there's no proof of that at all. And in fact, it could be said it's disrespectful of Meponus, who had very definite meanings and worship. For the Romans, Apollo was a god of light, sun, healing, prophecy, and music, and a few other things. We're still talking in Sarita's voice at this point. They must have observed some of the same qualities in the indigenous god Meponus. The equinox, like some of the other Wheel of the Year's festivals, can be thought of as a sun festival. While we have no evidence for festivals associated with Mabon, we do have records of some of the festivals held in honor of the god Apollo. One of those happened just before, preferably on the full moon before, the autumn equinox. Well now, let's get back to my opinion on this. Honestly, in this witch's opinion, and with all due respect to those who honor Mabon, his history is a bit sketchy, as is any historical proof as to his having been honored as deity. More than likely, in my opinion, he was more of a literary figure than a god. But that's okay. Honest, it's okay. For the stories that are told of him can fit, even with a bit of force-fitting, into the tales we tell of the holiday we've named after him. I want to mention to you, I seem to have in common with Sarita because she mentions it elsewhere in this article. When she was first practicing, like me, it was only the cross-quarter days that were celebrated. That's always it's a bit confusing to me, and I've never found answers to this particular question, no matter who I've read, because respected sources tend to disagree. I do know that in the 70s, my tradition was only celebrating the cross quarters. But at the same time, I'm reading that it was Gardner who really wanted to establish the 8 including the equinoxes and solstices, in addition to the cross quarters. I don't know about that. I've never been able to get a definitive answer that I felt comfortable was the definitive answer, but I can tell you that I never had to worry early on in my practice about who was Mabon and what were we celebrating, because it wasn't a holiday, the autumnal equinox, that was being celebrated. And it was probably late 70s, maybe early 80s, before the possibility of celebrating 8 holidays came up in my circles, and we embraced them. And I'm glad we did, because it really deepened and widened my experience at the spiritual level and also at the human level. So we're back to why adding in a celebration at the autumnal equinox that involved a god who might or not ever have been a god or had any form of worship, or may have been just a literary figure, if that. Why can it still be powerful? How can we fit him to the celebration of the autumn equinox? Well, I thought of a few things. The dimming of his light and his eventual return. Those countless years at which he was imprisoned from a child onwards until he was rescued in order to become the hero of some great tasks that had to be accomplished. He was gone from the world. Some of the stories say he was mourned, that the world was dark without him. Therefore, the connection perhaps to the concept of Persephone, a male version of Persephone, that the world wasn't quite right until he came back. Well, the withdrawal, in the metaphorical sense, of the god into the darkness at this time of year. That kind of aligns nicely to that, wouldn't you say? And I kind of like the idea of a consideration of some male version of a sun god whose light is diminished, as Persephone's light was diminished, to return again in the spring. There was also in those stories, no matter how true they were in actuality and in potential worship or not of him, the power of being in Modron's womb, dark, a place of challenge, and not necessarily a good place, but a place of nurturing and growth. I guess her womb was kind of like a womb of tough love, a real forging of character. He couldn't become who he ended up being without this time spent in this dark place that was an amazing combination of both challenge and love. He had to mature into his power, and he needed that place in order to fully develop. Well, that certainly fits in with the stories we tell about Mabon as a holiday. His mythology also often had him imprisoned in a cave of water, and there's some historical connection of his name tied to healing springs in his Gaulish French mythology. And that fits him nicely into the season of water, which begins at Mabon. So there's some ways in which he fits nicely into the meaning we have given the autumnal equinox. We'll have a similar story to explore como Stara, by the way, a goddess who doesn't necessarily contribute much to the holiday and about which there's not a lot of information. And again at Litha, that's another holiday that seems to have been named by Aidan Kelly again in the 70s. What's in a name, my friends? In regarding, though, to the naming of the autumnal equinox as Mabon, I'll leave it that it is a modern naming of the celebration of the equinox. It has nothing to do with a character that might have been named Mabon, and which may or may not have existed as anything other than a literary character. The name matters only in the fact that when I say Mabon, you think autumnal equinox. It's why I refer to it as that. So we'll both land on the same place. Me, I don't call the autumnal equinox Mabon personally. You've heard me refer to it by Mabon plenty of times here. That's the key word, so we knew exactly what time of year I was talking about. I've named it for myself Harvest Home. Just like dark and full moons, I suggest that serious seekers consider naming the 8 holidays and the full and the dark moons. Naming means you've decided, you've captured in that naming the essence of the holiday for you. For me, the autumnal equinox is harvest home. There is some history to that name, not ancient history, but it feels right to me. So, what will you call the autumnal equinox? Will you keep thinking of it as Mabon because we all know what Mabon is, don't we? We know it's the autumnal equinox. We know some of the symbology around the folklore and the mythology about this mysterious character called Mabon. We know the meaning we ascribe to the holiday. Is it that important that the name be something new? Or does Mabon capture everything that you feel about what the holiday is without having to be specific about the supposed deity himself? Here's my thoughts on Mabon ap Modron for you. And I wanted to mention to you the image that I'm using for the graphic for this video. It fits into this whole story of who, what, and if Mabon was. The image is the Loch Maiden stone. It's located in Scotland. Mabon had ties to Maponis, as I mentioned to you earlier, and this stone seems to be connected to that connection. And it dates to 3275 BC. The stone may or may not have been in honor of Mabon directly. It was at least an indication of the local town where it was said there was a body of water, a loch, named after him. That wouldn't be surprising since some of his mythology has him ensconced in that cave in the water for all those years. The translation of the writing on the stone indicates a burial place of Mabon. But there are no artifacts under the stone. The stone was once part of a larger stone circle, with few other stones currently remaining. And again, no artifacts to really give any depth to what the naming of the stone might be. It is in an area of where Mabon would have been worshipped by Romans as Maponis. I've used this image for the post because it's so like Mabon himself. A mystery. We don't know what that stone or that circle it was part of truly honors. It may have been a tribal gathering place. It may have been a place that honored the god Maponis, and it could or could not be that that god has any connection to a potential, possible historical Mabon. So I like the image because it captures the same feeling of my entire capturing in this video for you, which is, did he or did he not exist in any kind of sense of deity? Was he just part of a story of the Arthurian tradition, folklore? Or was there some essence of something that had been worshipped that no longer had words to capture it? In other words, forgotten in time. No matter, the important thing is what the autumnal equinox means to you. And it's also, I think, a gentle reminder to question everything. Question everything. The naming of all the holidays that were given as this is what it is. In fact, every single thing that we read, that we are told, indeed that we experience, is an opportunity for constant curiosity and questioning. Sometimes something doesn't have to be verifiable to be important. I certainly don't mind considering the holiday to be Mabon, even though personally I have a zilch relationship to it or him or whatever. It's a shared terminology. How does this feel for you? Would you accept this name comfortably? I do, but then again, I decided to name the autumnal equinox a name that held meaning and value for me. I wish you all mirth and reverence. Merry part.